Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of The Fairacre Festival by Miss Reed. Jock Graham was not the only Fairacre resident to be in a state of tension at this time. The vicar, facing the bishop's visit, was anxious about the service and also about the safety of the church fabric. What a terrible thing it would be if something should fall upon that stately figure. Despite reassurances, the vicar was not wholly at ease. Mrs. Partridge, whose privilege it was to entertain the bishop to lunch and possibly to tea, was busy planning a meal which would do honor to their distinguished visitor and yet be simple enough to prepare and serve single-handed. Cold salmon and salad had seemed a good choice until she remembered that the bishop was extremely short-sighted and far too handsome a man to relish wearing glasses at lunchtime. And just suppose that a fishbone appeared. It would without fail be on the guest's plate. Perhaps cold beef, or a leg of lamb left in a slow oven during the service and mint sauce made beforehand? Mrs. Partridge continued to cudgel her brains and to long for the days when the vicarage had a resident cook and 2 kitchen maids. Mr. Annett, the choir master, was worrying about the new anthem. The choir of St. Patrick's had left him in no doubt that he had bitten off more than they could chew. "This here modern stuff ain't got no tune to it," protested Mr. Willett. "What's wrong with a bit of Bach or Handel?" "It's a very good thing to make a change," Mr. Annett snapped back, secretly conscious that the new anthem was beyond their powers, but too proud to admit it. As Browning said, a man's reach should exceed his grasp. "Browning never had to tackle this lot," pointed out Mr. Willett, peering closely at the sheet of music. "If there's anything I hates, it's 5 flats." They had struggled on with their unfamiliar burden, but no matter how often they practiced, Mr. Annett realized that the anthem would turn out to be a hesitant dirge rather than the outpouring of praise which the composer had intended. Too late to do anything now, he told himself as the great Sunday approached, but the thought gave him little comfort. Basil Bradley, afflicted with his feverish cold, was suffering agonies of self-consciousness about the script which he had written and his recording of it. He had checked all his facts most carefully, but there was always the possibility of a mistake. How dreadful if he had made some blunder! There was that episode about the nun being given shelter in the vestry during the 18th century. Should he have had omitted it? There were some very dubious rumors about the incumbent at that date, and the bishop might take exception to that publicity, guarded though Basil's account had been of the affair. Really creative work was terribly exhausting, thought poor Basil, as he gargled hopelessly before the final rehearsal. A spell of unbroken sunshine preceded festival week, and we in Fairacre prayed that it might continue. It grew so hot that the children took many of their lessons outside in the shade of the elm trees. Rehearsals of the infants' contributions also took place in the playground, which afforded some relief to our class when it was working inside, and considerable interest to proud mothers who clustered at the gate to watch their offspring bounding around in the folk dance. The princess and the swineherd still had many faults. Ernest had overcome his shyness with such success, terrified of handing over the part to someone else, that he now played the prince with a swashbuckling impudence which was, to my mind, quite as offensive as his former interpretation had been. However, I was now resigned to the shortcomings of my production and simply concentrated on getting the cast word perfect, which was no light matter. Mr. Willett, as sexton, was concerned about the tidiness of the church and the churchyard. "Slummocky lot, them builders," he told me. "Drops their paper bags everywhere, bread crusts and cheese rinds and old potato crisps scattered all over the churchyard. Them mice is getting as big as foxes." "It will look splendid on Sunday," I assured him, "especially if this weather lasts." We looked across my garden to the meadows at the base of the downs. A heat haze veiled the distance, but nearer at hand a herd of black and white Frisian cows, the pride of Mr. Roberts, stood knee-deep in tall grass. No one moved. They might have been painted there, against the hot, motionless beauty of hills and empty sky, so still they stood. "Well, let's hope it does," agreed Mr. Willett. "Don't want to break yet a while. It'll end in thunder, or my name's not Willett." He turned to look at St. Patrick's. The scaffolding had been removed from the spire, but still clad the square tower containing the belfry and part of the nave. "Wish we could have rung in the bishop with a fine peal," he said regretfully, "but there it is. All 6 of the bells is up against the church wall, waiting to go aloft as soon as it's safe for 'em. I likes to go and look 'em over now and again. I've got a soft spot for them bells, particularly old Bess. They say she was cast in the field behind the Beetle and Wedge sometime in the 1560s. The children don't want the bells to go back again. They've been over to see them under my eagle eye, let me say, lots of times, and they've copied the inscriptions." "Sanctus, sanctus, sanctus," gabbled Mr. Willett, swatting a gnat on his freckled forearm. "In piem memoriam Caroli Fowler, requiescat in pace." Fowler notice. Still a good few Fowlers in Fairacre. Wonder if any of them cast old Bess. He bent to pull up a dandelion from my border and straightened up with a sigh. "I truly do hope this festival puts the old church on its feet. There's a lot at stake, Miss Reed, a lot at stake." Sunday dawned bright and beautiful. I took my breakfast tray into the garden among the dewy pinks and roses. A robin perched hopefully on the lilac bush nearby, a beady eye cocked for crumbs. The Union Jack hung motionless from the school flagpole. High above it, on St. Patrick's Church, the cross of St. George waited for a breeze to spread it out in its full red and white magnificence. It was already blissfully hot, although the clock said only 9. By 10 to 11, when I made my way to the church, the heat was almost oppressive. We were all in our best summer finery, and I felt quite sorry for the bishop, magnificently accoutred in splendid gold and white cope, which must have been uncomfortably warm. We sang the most exultant hymns, beginning with "Praise my soul, the King of Heaven," as the choir processed from the west door up to the chancel. Several of my pupils had undergone their weekly metamorphosis from scrubby urchins to well-scrubbed cherubs, and with hair plastered down with a wet brush and their eyes modestly downcast upon the polished boots peeping demurely from beneath their cassocks, they gave an impression of youthful sanctity which did not deceive those of us who knew them during the rest of the week. The new anthem was tackled with dogged effort, and Mr. Annett gave noble support not only with his hands and feet at the organ, but with a resonant voice which led his struggling choir valiantly. When it was over, I noticed Mr. Willett mopping his brow and mustache with obvious relief. The bishop gave the sermon and spoke of the part the church played in parish life, the disaster which had befallen it, and praised the efforts of our small community to repair the damage. "God will bless your work," he promised us. "This is a festival in every sense. It is an expression of praise for past mercies and a rededication of ourselves to service." He made a brave and unforgettable figure in our ancient pulpit, and his words were as inspiring as his presence. When the benediction had been said and Mr. Annett broke into a triumphant voluntary, we all felt that Fairacre was embarked upon a venture which was bound to succeed. We emerged into the hot sunshine, blinking like owls in the dazzling light. Around us, the rose bushes gave out a voluptuous fragrance. Above us, an aeroplane left a white trail in the cloudless sky. Bumblebees lumbered from cloverhead to cloverhead on the grassy mounds of our Fairacre forefathers. It was indeed high summer. "A real festival weather," said Miss Margaret Waters, gazing happily about her beneath the brim of her old-fashioned straw hat. "After all this looking forward," said her sister, "it's hard to believe that it's actually started." It was a thought we all shared as we made our various ways homeward to Sunday dinner. At last, the festival had begun. Chapter 6. Amy, my old college friend, drove over from Bent to the first performance of the Son et Lumière. It was to be a very grand affair. Several local landowners were bringing parties of guests, and we humbler folk were busy looking out our best evening attire. It was not easy to find something splendid enough for the occasion, decorous enough for church-going, and warm enough to counteract the chill of an evening in St. Patrick's drafty pews. I had plumped for safety in my plain black frock and had looked out my one fur piece, a useful stole, for despite the heat of the last few days, which had degenerated into an ominous still stuffiness, the age-long coolness of the church's interior would take some combating. Amy, soignée in a most beautiful frock of blue silk, looked me over critically. "You really shouldn't wear black, my dear, with your skin. It kills any sort of glow you have. Why not wear a deep red dress or brown?" "Because I haven't got one," I said flatly. Her eyes traveled without relish down my full length and lingered sadly at my feet. "Those heels are definitely out," she pronounced. "Not in Fairacre," I replied with spirit. "In fact, they've only just come in. I paid a great deal of money for these shoes, my girl, and I intend to get plenty of wear out of them." Amy shuddered delicately and fingered her one splendid adornment, a glittering diamond brooch on her shoulder. It was, I knew, a present from James, her husband, and marked his return from a particularly protracted business trip to the Bahamas. There are many such absences from home, about which I have my private suspicions, as no doubt Amy has too, but they result in the most beautiful presents for his wife, and she has enough sense not to cross-question James too closely. We sat down to my carefully prepared meal of cold chicken and salad. I was secretly rather proud of the salad, for I had remembered to cut the radishes into water lily shapes in the dinner hour and had left them soaking all afternoon. The tomatoes and cucumber had come from Mr. Willett's greenhouse, and the lettuce from my own garden. The hard-boiled eggs, winking goldenly from among the greenery, had come from Mrs. Pringle's hens, and the fine chicken was lately one of the members of her flock. Amy ate heartily, I was glad to see. "Also deliciously fresh," she commented, and I preened myself at this unaccustomed compliment. Prematurely, as I might have known. But I really think the latest way of dishing up a salad is better. Just a bowl of green stuff tossed in the very best olive oil and vinegar, and tomatoes freshly sliced in a separate dish, salted and peppered, and with a soupçon of chopped chives or parsley, of course, for those who like colored salad mixed with green. I find that most people these days consider radishes rather too coarse a flavor, and there's so much medical argument about hard-boiled eggs that I don't serve them, I must admit. "You'd better bring your own nose bag next time you come," I told her. I've known Amy too long to worry about her criticisms, and can well recall the hearty relish with which she attacked college bread and margarines with thick-cut Scottish marmalade, not to mention a truly repellent dish of minced meat in a suet crust which, with juvenile flippancy, we christened boiled baby. However, she approved graciously of my coffee, and as soon as we had finished, we set off to the church. "Looks like thunder," commented Amy, eyeing the darkening sky. It was a sullen, coppery look about the piled-up clouds, and not a leaf stirred in the airless heat. "Let's hope it waits until we're safely home again," I answered as we joined the queue at the south door. It was good to see St. Patrick's so full. Seldom had the ancient hammer-beam roof looked down upon such a glittering assembly. We had all done our best to make this a splendid occasion. I studied the attire and coiffures around me. There were several new hats worn by those who felt unable to attend church unless so crowned, and among them was one upon Mrs. Pringle's locks. It was entirely new to me. Where was the faithful old number adorned with dangling cherries? Where was the navy blue decorated with white feathers, which had first seen light at her niece Minnie's wedding? No doubt safely lodged on top of the wardrobe at home. I hoped so. I missed those two old friends, but studied the new creation with interest. It was of green straw, formidably brimmed, and garlanded with plastic anemones which looked suspiciously like those given away recently with packets of soap powder. It was exceedingly handsome, I thought, and proof of Mrs. Pringle's support for the festival. In the front pews sat our local gentry, elegant in silks and velvets, their hair blue-rinsed, silver-streaked, or discreetly tinted. Occasionally, wafts of delicious perfume floated back to us as a stole was rearranged or a handbag was opened. The nave was shadowy, but a shaft of golden light illuminated the chancel and altar. Mr. Annett at the organ played some gentle melody, vaguely familiar, which I guessed must be by Haydn or Mozart. St. Patrick's clock struck 9. The music stopped, and the vicar appeared at the chancel steps. "You are about to hear the story of Fairacre," he told us, "and in particular the story of this lovely old church. But before it begins, let us pray that we may see it restored to its former beauty, so that those who come after us may cherish it as we have done." We slipped to our knees and listened to the simple prayer. Then, with a susurration of silks and satins, we resumed our seats, eager for what might come. The golden light, which suffused the chancel, changed to a dim blue. The cross glimmered upon the altar amidst the ghostly shadows. We shivered in awe. It was very quiet. Only far away a faint rumbling could be heard. It could have been distant thunder, or a farm vehicle out late upon its lawful business. There was a faint crackling sound, and then Basil Bradley's voice echoed strongly through the church. "Long, long ago, so learned men tell us, the Romans may have passed this way. They did not settle here as far as we know. Among our downs, water is scarce, and there are few natural defenses against the elements or the enemy. The Romans left no sign of occupation here. But centuries later, when the next invaders came to Britain, they left their mark upon this place. Upon this spot, where now we are gathered, the Normans built a small, strong church, of which parts still remain." At this point, the chancel arch was thrown into prominence, a mellow golden light illuminating the angular stone carving. Few of Fairacre's parishioners had realized until this dramatic moment what unexpected richness had lain in the shadowy chancel arch so high above them. The work was probably begun about the middle of the 12th century. A crackling noise interrupted the mellifluous voice and was immediately followed by a burst of thunder, which broke around us like machine gun fire. We ducked involuntarily at the report, then, remembering ourselves, sat up and looked polite and attentive. The church was plunged in darkness, and the voice had ceased. A little agitated whispering rustled around the congregation. "Lord Almighty," boomed Mr. Roberts, whose voice is as large as his generous heart, "we've been and got struck." At this, commotion broke out on all sides. There was nothing panic-stricken about us. We are all used to storms, which can occur with horrifying ferocity, but they are soon over in Fairacre. What really worried us was the breakdown of the performance and the bitter disappointment of all those who had spent so long in preparing it. The vicar, rising from his seat to direct and comfort his flock, suddenly saw, with amazing clarity in his mind's eye, Queen Anne's chalice. It seemed to float in midair, brilliantly clear at first, but gradually fading as if it were passing away from him to distances unknown. The vicar's heart beat uncomfortably loudly. His throat grew constricted, but he put his fears from him and addressed his flock. "Please remain seated, dear people. Candles will be lit at once, and would Mr. Roberts be so kind as to step across to the vicarage and telephone the electricity board to see what can be done?" "I'm on my way, sir," called Mr. Roberts, and the crash of strong footsteps confirmed this. "Mark my words," said Amy beside me. "The Caxley Chronicle will tell us that this power cut was caused by a swan flying into the cable." "Perhaps it was," I replied. "Fiddlesticks," snapped Amy. "It was the storm." A jagged flash split the sky, to be followed by another reverberating thunderclap. "It's further off," said someone hopefully. "You want to count 1, 2, 3, 4, see? As soon as the lightning comes, you start counting and sees how many you gets before the thunder bangs out. That'll tell you how many miles off the storm be." I recognized the voice of this young know-all as Ernest, my swineherd prince. "You speak when you're spoken to," said his mother in a scandalized whisper, "piping up like that, and in church, too." A few scurrying figures flitted about the shadows bearing candles. There was a medieval beauty about their down-bent heads and their curved hands sheltering the precious tiny flames from any draught, which was poignantly in keeping with the ancient building. "Mr. Annett," announced the vicar, "will play some music by Bach while we wait." We settled back against the hard pew backs and let the sonorous chords flow over us. How many of our Fairacre forebears, I wondered, had listened to Bach by candlelight as we were doing now? My mind began to wander. There was something wonderfully comforting in the thought that we shared so much in this building with those long dead and those yet unborn. We were, after all, simply a link in a long chain stretching back for centuries and forward into eternity. The candle flames stretched and wavered in the draught. A rumble of thunder rattled over the roof. "I told you so," whispered Ernest defensively. "It's going away." At that moment, Mr. Roberts appeared. "The power will be back any minute," he announced. "A swan has flown into the cable, they say." Amy nudged me with such vigor that my side was quite sore. "Thank you, Mr. Roberts," said the vicar. "Let us sing a hymn together while we wait." After some whispering with Mr. Annett, the vicar proclaimed, "Pleasant are thy courts above," and we all dutifully arose in the twilit church and raised our voices. As we reached the last line, the lights came on again, and we sang the Amen with undue fervor. We resumed our seats expectantly, and Basil Bradley, looking slightly careworn, appeared at the chancel steps. "I think we had better begin again from the beginning, ladies and gentlemen. We are so very sorry for this breakdown. Please bear with us, and let us hope that all is now plain sailing." There were sympathetic murmurs from the congregation. The lights went out, and the blue spotlight lit up the altar once more. There was a preliminary crackle, and then Basil Bradley's voice as before. "Long ago, so learned men tell us, the Romans may have passed this way." We settled back, like children hungry for a story, and gave ourselves up to enjoyment. It took a little over an hour for the tale to unfold, and so well had Basil Bradley told it, and so beautiful had the lighting been, that we emerged from the experience filled with unbounded admiration, tinged with awe. Even Amy was impressed. "Remarkably good," she said as we walked home. "Really outstandingly good. It ought to bring hundreds of visitors." "Let's hope it does," I replied. £2,000 takes some finding. "I wonder if the national press will write it up," mused Amy. "It deserves it. You'll get people from all over the place if it's widely advertised." "We've done our best," I assured her. "It's been in all the local papers, I know." "I think I shall send a letter to the Times," said Amy, climbing elegantly into her car. "We want to cast the net really wide." She drove off, and I returned to the schoolhouse. Distant voices in the lane and the sound of cars starting on their homeward journeys formed the epilogue to Basil Bradley's moving production. A star, bright as a jewel, hung beside St. Patrick's spire. It looked hopeful, I thought, as I prepared for bed. If the rest of Fairacre contributions matched this evening's in splendor, our festival must surely succeed, and more important still, Queen Anne's chalice would remain among those who loved it so well. And we'll trace the history of the festival further next time.